The waitress with a secret. The warm scent of freshly baked bread and simmering sauces drifted through the dimly lit, high-end restaurant, La Lumiere, where the soft hum of conversation blended with the occasional clink of crystal glasses. The air pulsed with an understated elegance, a sanctuary for the city's elite to indulge in the pleasures of fine dining and exclusivity. At the heart of the bustling establishment, Alina Carter, a waitress barely in her 20s, moved with quiet grace, balancing trays laden with gourmet meals. Dressed in the restaurant's uniform, a crisp white blouse tucked into a sleek black skirt, she exuded an air of quiet professionalism, her deep brown eyes betraying nothing of the exhaustion she carried. She wasn't supposed to be here, not forever. The rhythmic hum of the dining room, the clatter of cutlery, the murmurs of the wealthy patrons, all of it was a world apart from the one she had imagined for herself. Once, her hands had danced over ivory piano keys instead of serving trays. Once she had been destined for something greater. But fate had rewritten her story. The dreams she had nurtured since childhood, the endless hours spent at the piano, the competitions, the standing ovations, had been put on pause. Her acceptance letter to Kingston Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music institutions in the country, still sat unopened in a drawer at home, mocking her. A dream within reach, stolen by reality. Her father's unexpected passing had left a mountain of debts, and with her younger sister still in high school and her mother working multiple shifts just to keep their tiny apartment, Alina had done what she had to do. She had stepped up, picked up the pieces, and traded in her future for survival. But the music had never left her. Every night after the restaurant closed, she would sit in the empty dining hall, where a polished grand piano stood near the lounge area, untouched by anyone but the hired pianists on special occasions. And when the world slept, Alina would let her fingers glide over the keys in the dark, whispering to the silence the songs of a life that could have been. She thought no one knew, until Damien Sinclair arrived. The arrival of power. The air shifted the moment Damien Sinclair entered the restaurant. The name alone was enough to stir a reaction, whispers darting through the staff like wildfire. A billionaire investor, real estate mogul, and philanthropist, Damien wasn't just rich. He was power in human form. The kind of man whose presence demanded attention without so much as a word. Seated at a private table in the corner, he exuded quiet authority. A charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection, a Rolex glinting on his wrist, and an expression that revealed little but calculated observation. He wasn't here for casual dining. His visits were always purposeful. And tonight, Alina was about to be a part of that purpose. Table 7, Marcus, the restaurant manager, murmured as he passed her the order. Sinclair, make sure everything's perfect. Alina exhaled slowly, smoothing her hands over her apron before approaching. Balancing the tray carefully, she placed his drink, a Dalmore 62 whiskey, aged and rare, on the table before him. "Good evening, Mr. Sinclair," she said smoothly, her voice professional. "Your drink, as requested." His gaze lifted, and for the first time, their eyes met. A storm brewed behind those piercing blue irises, a mind that measured people, calculated their worth within moments. And in that instant, Alina felt seen, not just as a waitress, but as something more. "Thank you," he said, his voice a deep, controlled baritone. She gave a polite nod, turning to leave, but his voice stopped her. Alina Carter. Her breath caught. She turned back, her heart hammering. "Yes, sir." He leaned back, studying her. "You play the piano." Her stomach twisted. How did he know? "I." She forced a neutral expression. "I used to." Sinclair's lips curled at the corner, a knowing smirk. "Not just used to. I heard you." He swirled the whiskey in his glass. "You played Claire de Lune last night. Beautifully, I might add." Alina's throat tightened. He had been there, watching, listening. She faltered, regaining composure. "I didn't realize anyone was around." "You didn't notice," he corrected. "That's different." The weight of his gaze pinned her in place. He wasn't asking. He was testing. "Why are you here, serving food, when you should be on a stage?" His voice was smooth, but the question was sharp, cutting into her deepest wound. Alina clenched her jaw. Life doesn't always go as planned. He studied her for a long moment before leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I have an event next weekend. A private gala. I need entertainment." His fingers tapped against the whiskey glass. "I want you to play." Alina blinked. "What? She hesitated. "I haven't performed in a long time." Sinclair smirked. "That's not an answer." She shook her head, overwhelmed. I don't know if I can." His eyes gleamed. "You can." He leaned back, voice unwavering. "And you will." She should have refused. She should have walked away, let this opportunity slip through her fingers the way all others had. But something about Sinclair, his confidence, his certainty, made her pulse race. And so, against every rational thought, she nodded. "Fine. I'll do it." Sinclair's smirk widened, as though he had already known her answer before she did. "Good," he said simply. "Then I'll see you Saturday." Alina turned and walked away, but in her chest, her heart pounded with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And she didn't yet know this night was the beginning of everything. The Billionaire's Challenge. The moment Alina Carter stepped out of La Lumiere, the weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulders. The city stretched before her in a blur of golden lights and restless energy, but her mind was trapped in a loop, replaying every detail of her conversation with Damien Sinclair. A private gala. A chance to play again. A man who had barely known her, but had seen through her in mere moments. She inhaled sharply, tugging her coat tighter around her frame as the winter breeze nipped at her skin. What had she just agreed to? A rational voice inside her screamed, this was a mistake. She hadn't performed in years. Her hands weren't as nimble as they used to be. She had spent so much time being a waitress, surviving, that she had nearly forgotten who she used to be. And yet, Sinclair's voice echoed in her mind. "You can, and you will." The certainty in his words unsettled her. He was a man who wasn't used to hearing no. And deep down, in a place she barely acknowledged, a tiny part of her thrilled at the challenge. The phantom of the past. By the time Alina made it home, it was close to midnight. Their tiny apartment was dark except for the flickering glow of the kitchen light. She could hear the faint hum of the TV in the living room, where her mother had fallen asleep, still in her nurse's scrubs. A stack of unpaid medical bills sat beside her. Alina's stomach twisted. Her younger sister, Lily, was curled up on the couch beside their mother, textbooks scattered around her. The sight made Alina's chest ache. She crouched down and brushed a stray strand of hair from her mother's face. She looked so tired. A familiar guilt surged within her. She had abandoned her dreams because her family needed her, and she'd do it again without hesitation. But now she had been handed an opportunity she never expected. Could she really take it? She tiptoed toward her tiny bedroom and shut the door, exhaling as she leaned against it. The room was bare bones, just a small bed, a thrift store desk, and a rickety old bookshelf. But in the farthest corner, buried beneath blankets, sat an old keyboard. Alina hesitated before stepping toward it, heart pounding. She hadn't played on it in months. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant at first. But then, she pressed down. A single soft note rang out in the silent room. Then another, and another. A melody took shape, one she hadn't played since she left Kingston Conservatory. The sound was uneven, rusty, but the fire was still there. Sinclair had seen it, and now, as her hands moved instinctively, she felt it. A spark of something she thought she had lost. Hope. A deal with the devil. The following day, Alina arrived at the Sinclair building, a towering skyscraper made of glass and steel, reflecting the early morning sun like something untouchable. It was his empire, built from the ground up. And now she was stepping inside it. The lobby was pristine, with towering marble pillars and a sleek modern design. The receptionist, a polished woman with sharp red nails, barely spared Elena a glance as she gestured to the elevators. "Mr. Sinclair is expecting you." Elena stepped inside, her nerves coiling. The elevator ride to the top floor felt endless. When the doors slid open, she was met with an entirely different world. A vast office with floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled out beneath them. And at the center of it all, standing near his desk, was Damien Sinclair. He wasn't dressed in a suit this time. Instead, he wore a fitted black dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing strong, sculpted forearms. He looked both effortless and intimidating. He turned as she entered, his piercing blue eyes locking onto her with a flicker of amusement. "You actually came," he mused, swirling a glass of whiskey. At 10 in the morning. Elena lifted her chin, masking her nervousness. "You gave me very little choice." Sinclair smirked, gesturing toward a black leather chair across from his desk. "Sit." She hesitated before lowering herself into the seat. The billionaire leaned against his desk, folding his arms. "This gala isn't just some casual party," he said. "It's a gathering of some of the most powerful people in the city. CEOs, investors, people who make decisions that shape industries." Elena frowned. "And why exactly do you need me?" His smirk faded, his gaze turning calculating. "Because in my world, people aren't just entertained. They're impressed. They want to be in the presence of exceptional talent." He tilted his head slightly. "And you, Elena, are exceptional." Her breath caught. "You don't even know me," she said, skeptical. "I know talent when I see it," he countered smoothly. There was something unnerving about the way he spoke, as if he already knew she would succeed, as if he had already decided her fate. "And what do you get out of this?" she pressed. Sinclair's lips twitched. "I like surrounding myself with the best. You play well. You elevate my event. You impress my investors." She narrowed her eyes. "So I'm just a showpiece to you." He chuckled, slow and deep. "I don't collect people, Elena. I create opportunities." He set his glass down and leaned in slightly. "This is your chance to remind the world who you are. To remind yourself." Her heart pounded. "You've got 5 days," he continued. "You'll practice at one of my private studios. I expect you to be ready." Elena swallowed. "What if I say no?" Sinclair's smirk returned, lazy and full of challenge. "Then you'll go back to waiting tables, pretending you don't miss the music." He arched an eyebrow. "But we both know you'd be lying." Her hands curled into fists. Damn him. Because he was right. She exhaled sharply. "Fine. I'll do it." A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. "Good choice." He extended his hand. Elena hesitated before shaking it. His grip was firm, warm, steady, but she felt the silent warning beneath it. She wasn't just stepping into an opportunity. She was stepping into his world. And Damien Sinclair didn't just offer things freely. He owned them, including, perhaps, her fate. The countdown begins. As she stepped back into the elevator, her heart still hammering in her chest, she knew this was it. 5 days to prepare. 5 days to prove to Sinclair, to herself, to everyone, that she still had it. She just had no idea that by the end of those 5 days, she wouldn't just be playing music. She would be playing a far more dangerous game. One with a billionaire who never lost. And one where the stakes were far greater than she ever imagined. The billionaire's game. A clock counting down. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, aching fingers, and a whispering voice of doubt that refused to let Elena rest. She had 5 days to prepare for the most important performance of her life. 5 days to step back into the shoes of a pianist when she had spent years pretending that part of her no longer existed. 5 days to prove to Damien Sinclair and to herself that she belonged in that world. But there was something about this that didn't sit right. Damien had everything: wealth, power, influence. He could have hired an entire orchestra if he wanted. Yet, out of all the musicians in the city, he had chosen her. Why? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a simple performance at a gala, that she was a piece on his chessboard, and she had no idea what game he was playing. The Sinclair studio. On the second day, Elena was sent an address, a private studio owned by Sinclair, hidden away in a high-rise overlooking the city. When she arrived, a sleek black keycard granted her access. She stepped inside to find a room unlike anything she had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering skyline. A polished Steinway grand piano sat in the center, its lacquered black surface reflecting the golden glow of the city lights. The space was utterly silent, save for the soft hum of the building's heating system. She ran her fingers over the piano keys, pressing down lightly. The sound that echoed was perfect, rich, full, resonating through her very bones. For a moment, she let herself forget everything else. The doubts, the exhaustion, the fact that she had no idea why Sinclair was helping her. For a moment, it was just her and the music, until a voice shattered the stillness. "You're stiff." Elena jumped, spinning around. Damien Sinclair leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her like a predator. She exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her chest. "Jesus, do you always sneak up on people like that?" A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You were too focused to notice." She narrowed her eyes. "What are you doing here?" "This is my studio." He stepped forward, his presence filling the space. "I like to check on my investments." Her hands curled into fists. "I'm not one of your business acquisitions, Sinclair." "Debatable," he murmured, his gaze flickering to the piano. "Now, play something." She hesitated. "I don't need an audience to practice." His eyes darkened. "You do if you want to be ready for the gala." She knew he was right. Taking a slow breath, she turned back to the Steinway, positioning her fingers over the keys. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, a piece that had always been a part of her. The first notes filled the room, soft and haunting. But something was off. Her hands trembled. The notes weren't as fluid as they should have been. She could feel Sinclair watching her, and it unsettled her. She finished the first movement and dropped her hands onto her lap, exhaling in frustration. "It's not good enough," she muttered. Sinclair stepped closer, his voice low, unreadable. "You're playing to impress. That's your mistake." She frowned. "Isn't that the point?" He shook his head. "No, you need to play to move people." His gaze locked onto hers, to make them feel something. Elena swallowed hard. She wanted to argue, but the truth was, he wasn't wrong. Somewhere along the way, she had become afraid to feel too much when she played. Afraid that if she did, she would break apart completely. Sinclair studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the piano. Again. And so, she played, over and over, until the notes didn't just sound right. They felt right. And Sinclair, he never looked away. An invitation and a warning. By the fourth day, Elena was exhausted. Her fingers ached. Her body was running on coffee and sheer stubbornness. But she was improving. The stiffness in her playing was fading, and with every passing hour, she felt more and more like the pianist she had once been. She should have been relieved. But something nagged at her, and when she arrived at the studio that evening, she found someone unexpected waiting for her. A woman, tall, elegant, dangerous. She was perched on the edge of the piano bench, long legs crossed, running a manicured nail over the keys. "You're the waitress," the woman mused, her voice smooth like aged whiskey. Elena stiffened. "And you are." The woman smirked. "A friend of Damien's." Something about the way she said it sent warning bells ringing in Elena's mind. "You should be careful," the woman continued, her gaze sharp. "Men like Sinclair don't do things out of kindness. Alina's jaw tightened. I never said he was kind. The woman's smirk deepened. Smart girl, but still naive. She stood, brushing off her dress, before stepping closer. He doesn't let people in easily, she murmured. But when he does, she leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a whisper. He doesn't let them go. Alina's pulse spiked. Before she could respond, the woman turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Alina was frozen. She had no idea who that woman was. But the warning was loud and clear. Damien Sinclair was dangerous, and she was already too deep to walk away. The night before, everything changed. By the time the fifth day arrived, the anticipation was suffocating. Sinclair hadn't been around for the last 2 days, and for some reason, that made Alina uneasy. But when she entered the studio that night, he was waiting for her. Dressed in black, his sleeves rolled up, his watch glinting under the dim lighting. Something about him looked sharper, more dangerous. "You're ready," he said simply. Alina lifted her chin. "You sound confident." "I am." There was no hesitation in his voice. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "And tomorrow night," he murmured, "you're going to do something impossible." Alina swallowed. "And what's that?" He smirked. "You're going to make the world remember your name." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Because for the first time, she believed him. The night that changed everything. A world she didn't belong in. The moment Alina Carter stepped into Sinclair Manor, she realized she didn't belong here. The mansion was something out of a dream or a nightmare. Elegant chandeliers dripped with crystal. The floors gleamed like polished obsidian. Waiters in immaculate uniforms floated through the crowd carrying trays of the world's finest champagne. The guests, CEOs, tech moguls, oil tycoons, politicians, dressed in silks and tailored suits, their laughter rich with the confidence of those who had never known hunger. This was Damien Sinclair's world. And she was about to be the main event. The ghost of Alina Carter. She shouldn't have been nervous. Not after 5 days of practicing until her fingers ached. Not after the countless hours of Sinclair standing over her, breaking her apart and rebuilding her again. But as she stood there, wrapped in a stunning midnight blue gown, one that she hadn't chosen, but had been waiting for her at the studio that morning, the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on her. This wasn't just about playing the piano. This was about proving to everyone in that room, including herself, that she was more than a waitress, that she had never stopped being a musician. A hand landed lightly on her waist. She stiffened. Damien Sinclair stood beside her, dressed in a black suit, impeccable, effortless, dangerous. "You look like you belong here," he murmured. She let out a soft scoff. "I feel like I'm playing a role." He smirked, his gaze drifting over her face, searching. "Maybe. But tell me, Alina, do you want to belong?" She turned to look at him, her heart hammering. The answer should have been no. But it wasn't. Before she could say anything, a voice boomed through the grand hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Sinclair Gala." The room fell silent. The MC stood at the center, microphone in hand. "Tonight, we have a very special performance. A woman whose talent will leave you speechless." A beat of silence. Then, "Please welcome to the stage, Alina Carter." A hushed murmur spread through the crowd. Sinclair leaned in, his voice low. "A warning, a promise. Go show them who you are." She swallowed hard and stepped onto the stage, the performance that broke the world. The grand piano stood in the center of the room, gleaming beneath the golden lights. Alina settled onto the bench, her heartbeat so loud she could barely hear anything else. She could feel their eyes. Some were curious, some were bored, but most doubtful. They didn't expect much. After all, she was just a waitress playing dress-up in a billionaire's fantasy. She placed her fingers on the keys. And then, she played. The first note cut through the silence like a blade. Soft, controlled. then another, and another. And suddenly, she wasn't in Sinclair Manor anymore. She was 16 again, playing in her childhood home, her father watching from the couch, nodding in quiet approval. She was 17, competing in her first recital, the judges scribbling down notes she would never get to read. She was 18, opening her acceptance letter to Kingston Conservatory, believing, truly believing, that her life was about to begin. She was 19, standing in a hospital room, watching her father fade away, realizing that dreams didn't matter when reality demanded sacrifice. Every single moment, every lost hope poured into the music. The melody swelled, raw and aching, until the entire room forgot how to breathe, until the murmurs vanished, until there was only her. And then, silence. The final note lingered, stretching through the air like a whispered secret. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, thunderous applause. The walls of Sinclair Manor shook with it. Some of the guests stood, their claps deafening. Others simply stared, speechless, overwhelmed. And Damien Sinclair, he didn't clap. He just watched her, something unreadable burning in his gaze. Something that terrified her. Because she had the sudden, sinking feeling. She had just changed everything. The price of perfection. After the performance, Alina barely had time to process what had happened before a storm of people surrounded her. You were incredible. Where have you been hiding? Are you available for private performances? She tried to answer, tried to keep up, but the world was spinning too fast. Then suddenly, a firm hand wrapped around her wrist. Sinclair's hand. He pulled her from the crowd, guiding her through the maze of guests until they slipped into a quiet side hallway. Alina barely had time to catch her breath before he turned to her, his expression impossibly unreadable. You did more than impress them, he murmured. You left them haunted. Her pulse pounded. Is that a good thing? Sinclair's lips curled at the edges, but there was no humor in it. It's dangerous. Her stomach twisted. Why? He exhaled slowly, stepping closer. Because now, you're valuable. Alina's breath caught. And for the first time, she realized. This had never been about a simple performance. This had been a test. And she had passed. Too well. Sinclair's gaze darkened, his voice low. Are you ready for what comes next, Alina? A shiver ran down her spine. Because she already knew the answer. No, she wasn't ready. Not for him. Not for this world. Not for the storm that was coming. But it was too late now. Because she had played her first move. And in Damien Sinclair's game, there was no way out. The price of genius. The shift in the air. Alina Carter had expected applause. She had expected admiration. What she hadn't expected was the change in the atmosphere after her performance. The room wasn't just impressed. It was hungry. She could feel it, the way the powerful men and women in their designer clothes now looked at her differently. Not as a waitress, not even just as a musician, but as something rare, something to own. She had seen it before, how the rich and powerful collected things, art, cars, influence, people. And now she had made the mistake of showing them exactly how valuable she was. Damien Sinclair had warned her. And now she understood why. A deal with the devil. Sinclair hadn't let go of her wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to make it clear. He wasn't letting her walk away yet. You need to leave, he murmured. Alina frowned, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. What? I thought the night was just beginning. His jaw tensed. Exactly. And you don't belong in what comes next. She didn't like the way he said it. Like she was some fragile thing that needed protecting. Like he had decided that she needed him to shield her from whatever happened behind closed doors in this world. She yanked her wrist free. I don't need you to. You don't know what you just did. His voice was sharper now, his blue eyes burning. You came in here as a waitress who could play piano, Now you're leaving as the woman who stole the entire night with a single performance." Alina's breath caught. Sinclair leaned in, lowering his voice. "And in a room full of men who collect talent like trophies, that makes you a target." Her stomach twisted. She wanted to believe he was exaggerating, that this was just Sinclair's way of trying to control her, like he did with everything else. But deep down, she knew better. She had seen the way some of the wealthiest guests had watched her after she played, not just with admiration, with possession, like they were already deciding what to do with her. Her fingers clenched into fists. She hated that he was right, and she hated even more that it made her want to run. A dangerous proposition. "All right," she muttered. "Fine. I'll leave." But as soon as she turned, she found herself face to face with someone else. A tall man in his late 40s, dressed in a suit worth more than her apartment. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, his smile perfectly polished. But his eyes were as cold as the gold-plated watch on his wrist. "Miss Carter," the man said smoothly, offering his hand. Alina hesitated before shaking it. "Yes." The man glanced at Sinclair before smirking slightly, as if amused by something. "My name is Vincent Langley," he said. "I run a private entertainment firm that specializes in exceptional talent." Alina felt her stomach drop. Sinclair's expression turned into a mask of ice. Langley continued, completely unfazed by the billionaire's presence. "I'd love to discuss opportunities for you," he said, slipping a gold-plated business card into her hand. "We should talk soon. I believe you could make a lot of money, more than you ever imagined, doing what you do best." Alina swallowed, her fingers tightening around the card. Sinclair took a step forward, placing himself slightly between her and Langley. "I don't think she's interested," he said flatly. Langley raised an eyebrow. "Let the lady decide, Sinclair." His gaze flickered back to Alina, assessing her like an investment. "You have real talent, Miss Carter. Don't waste it being a side attraction." Sinclair's jaw locked. Alina felt caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. But she wasn't stupid. She recognized a power play when she saw one. And right now, she was the pawn, the escape. "Thank you for the offer," Alina said carefully. "But I need to think about it." Langley smiled as if he had already won. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Take your time, but not too long." He gave Sinclair a knowing look, then turned and disappeared into the crowd. Alina let out a slow breath. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. Sinclair ran a hand down his face, looking exasperated and furious all at once. That was Vincent Langley, the businessman, the vulture, and someone who doesn't take no for an answer. Alina frowned. "So he recruits musicians?" Sinclair scoffed. "He recruits people with talent, people he can turn into commodities for his elite clientele." Alina's stomach curdled. "You mean?" Sinclair met her gaze, his expression turning dark. "You're smart. Figure it out." A cold realization swept over her. Langley didn't just want to sign her. He wanted to own her. She shuddered. Sinclair grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the nearest exit. "You're leaving. Now." She was too shaken to argue. They stepped outside into the crisp night air, where a sleek black car was already waiting. Alina turned to him, her mind still racing. "I don't understand," she muttered. "Why does this feel like I just walked into something bigger than me?" Sinclair exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because you did." A heavy silence settled between them. Then he spoke again, his voice low. "If you stay in this world, Alina, you need to understand something." She swallowed. "What?" He held her gaze, his blue eyes dead serious. "Talent like yours." He exhaled slowly. "It comes with a price." Alina's heart pounded. "And you?" she whispered. "What do you want from me?" Sinclair was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. I want to protect you, he murmured. But there was something else in his eyes. Something darker. Something possessive. And Elena had the sudden, terrifying realization. Maybe the most dangerous man in this world was him, caught in the game. The aftermath of a performance that changed everything. The car ride away from Sinclair Manor was suffocatingly silent. Elena Carter sat in the leather seat of Damien Sinclair's sleek black Aston Martin, the city lights flashing by in a blur outside. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air, dark, expensive, and unmistakably him. She had spent the entire night under the scrutiny of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the city. She had played a single piece of music, one piece, and now her entire life was on the verge of something she didn't yet understand. And Sinclair, he was furious. She could feel it in the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, in the way his jaw remained clenched, in the tension that radiated off of him in waves. Finally, she broke the silence. Are you going to say anything? His grip on the wheel tightened. You don't understand what you just walked into, Elena. Her temper flared. Then explain it to me. He exhaled sharply but didn't look at her. Vincent Langley isn't someone you want attention from. She crossed her arms. He just offered me an opportunity. Isn't that what you wanted? Sinclair let out a bitter laugh. Langley doesn't offer opportunities. He offers contracts that turn into cages. Elena frowned. You mean he? Sinclair's voice was dangerously low. He collects talent, Elena. People like you. He molds them into something that makes him money. And when they stop being valuable, he tosses them aside. A cold chill crawled up her spine. She wanted to believe he was exaggerating. But the warning in his voice felt real. He's going to contact you, Sinclair continued. He's going to make you an offer that sounds too good to be true. He glanced at her, his blue eyes dark and unreadable. And if you take it, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Elena shivered. Then what do you suggest I do? She whispered. Sinclair turned onto a quiet street, slowing the car in front of a penthouse building she didn't recognize. She glanced at him, confused. This isn't my apartment. No, he murmured. It's mine. An invitation she couldn't refuse. The elevator ride up to Damien Sinclair's penthouse was silent. Elena wasn't sure why she was here. Maybe because Langley's presence had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Maybe because the world she had walked into tonight was so much bigger, darker, and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Or maybe because something inside of her was telling her Sinclair was the only person who could help her navigate it. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a space that was nothing like she had expected. It wasn't cold and corporate like she thought it would be. Instead, it was personal. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering skyline. A grand piano sat near the glass, untouched but perfectly placed. Dark leather furniture, sleek bookshelves, a stocked bar. Everything screamed power and precision. But the thing that caught her attention, a single framed photograph sitting on the piano. A picture of a young Sinclair and an older woman with striking blue eyes. The same eyes he had. His mother. Elena turned to him, curiosity flickering in her gaze. You play? Sinclair's expression darkened as he stepped into the room. I used to. She watched him carefully. What happened? His jaw tightened. Life happened. He walked toward the bar, pouring himself a drink, his movements controlled, deliberate, guarded. She hesitated before stepping toward the piano. Can I? He nodded once. She sat down, fingers brushing against the keys. Then, without thinking, she played. Something soft, something simple. Scarborough Fair. The melody hung in the air like a whispered memory. Sinclair froze. She noticed the way his hands clenched around his glass, the way his gaze turned dangerous, sharp, conflicted. You know that piece, she murmured. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, his voice. Low, strained. My mother used to play it. Elena swallowed. She taught you. Sinclair exhaled, setting his glass down. She tried. But after she died, I never touched a piano again. The weight of his words settled between them. Elena didn't know why, but her chest ached for him, for whatever he had lost, for whatever had made him the man he was now. Cold, calculating, closed off. Then why do you still have this? She asked softly, gesturing to the piano. Sinclair's lips curled into something almost bitter. Because I like to remember. Their eyes met. And suddenly, the air felt too charged, too heavy. So Elena did the only thing she could. She played. Not just for him. For both of them. A dangerous line. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Sinclair hadn't moved. He simply watched her, his gaze like a storm she couldn't escape. Finally, he stepped closer. You should stay here tonight. Elena's breath caught. What? It's late, he said smoothly. And if Langley is as interested in you as I think he is, he'll have people watching your apartment. She shivered. You really think he'd go that far? Sinclair's expression hardened. I know he would. She hesitated. Every part of her should have said no. But the truth was, she wasn't ready to be alone with her thoughts tonight. So, slowly, she nodded. Sinclair smirked slightly. Guest rooms down the hall. He started to turn away, but something inside her made her stop him. Damien. He paused. She swallowed. Why are you helping me? A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, his voice. Low, unreadable. Because for the first time in a long time, I'm not sure if I want to let you go. Her heart slammed against her ribs, and she knew this was a dangerous, dangerous game. But maybe she had already lost. The breaking point. A night she should have left. The guest room was impossibly luxurious. Silk sheets, soft lighting, a window that framed the city like a painted masterpiece. The kind of place where people like her didn't belong. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, fingers gripping the cool sheets, her mind spinning. She should have gone home. Should have ignored Sinclair's warning and walked away from all of this. But she didn't. Because deep down she knew she wasn't safe anymore. And Sinclair, for all his coldness, his impossibly arrogant control, his unreadable stares, he was the only one keeping her from falling into something she didn't understand. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She turned. Come in. The door cracked open, and Sinclair stepped inside, the dim light casting sharp shadows across his face. He wasn't in a suit anymore. Just a simple black shirt, sleeves pushed up, showing the defined muscles of his forearms, the watch that looked expensive enough to buy her apartment 3 times over. Elena swallowed. Can't sleep? He asked. She shook her head. Sinclair exhaled, stepping closer, leaning against the wall with that quiet, dangerous ease that was so him. You're not afraid of me, he said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Elena tilted her head. Should I be? He smirked slightly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Most people are. She studied him for a long moment. Maybe that's because they don't really see you. A flicker of something crossed his face, something sharp, something almost vulnerable. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. You don't know me, Elena. She didn't know what possessed her, but she stood, stepping closer. Then tell me. Silence. For the first time, Damien Sinclair looked like he didn't have an answer, like he wasn't the one in control. And for some reason, that made her breath hitch. The ghost of a man she didn't understand. You think I'm helping you, he murmured, voice low. She frowned. Aren't you? A humorless chuckle. Do you know how I built my empire, Elena? He asked, tilting his head slightly. How I went from nothing to controlling half of this city. She crossed her arms. Let me guess. Hard work, ruthless deals, and stepping over the competition. His smirk widened, but his gaze darkened. Something like that. He took another step toward her, his presence overwhelming. But the real secret, his voice dropped lower. I never let myself get attached. Something in her chest tightened. To anything, she whispered. Sinclair's jaw flexed. To anyone. He studied her, his gaze intense. And yet here I am, he muttered, almost to himself, telling you things I shouldn't. Alina's heart pounded. She should walk away, should break whatever this was before it started. But she didn't. Instead, she whispered, maybe you're tired of being alone. A sharp inhale, a flicker of something deeply human in his eyes. For a moment, she thought he might step back. Instead, he reached up, fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. You have no idea what you're playing with, Alina, he murmured. Neither do you, she wanted to say. Instead, she simply held his gaze, and the space between them disappeared. A line they shouldn't have crossed. The kiss was slow, deliberate, a test, a warning, a war. Sinclair's fingers curled at her waist, pulling her against him, like he was trying to convince himself this wasn't a mistake. Alina should have pulled away, should have told him this was reckless, that they were nothing alike, that he was too dangerous and too powerful for someone like her. But all she could feel was the way his hands tightened around her, the way he deepened the kiss like he was losing himself in it, like he was losing himself in her. And then, just as suddenly as it began, he stopped. His breath was ragged, his hand still gripping her waist, but his expression was unreadable. This is a bad idea, he muttered. Alina exhaled sharply, her own heart racing. Then why did you do it? A muscle ticked in his jaw. Because I can't stop myself. Her breath hitched. And for the first time, she realized. Neither could she. The fallout. The next morning, everything felt different. Sinclair had left before she woke up, a single note on the bedside table. Be careful today. D. That was it. No explanation. No talk about what had happened. Alina clenched her jaw, pushing away the ache in her chest. Fine. If he wanted to pretend like nothing had changed, she could do the same. But as soon as she left the penthouse, reality crashed back in. Because Vincent Langley was waiting for her, right outside the building, leaning casually against a sleek black car. His smirk was slow and dangerous. Miss Carter, he drawled. I was beginning to think you were avoiding me. Her stomach coiled with unease. I'm not interested, she said firmly. Langley chuckled. That's the thing about interest, Alina. His eyes gleamed. It's not always yours that matters. Her pulse spiked. Consider my offer carefully, he continued, his voice like silk. Because if you refuse me, he smiled. And it wasn't friendly. It won't just be Sinclair who's watching you. A chill ran down her spine. Langley opened the car door and slid inside, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, heart pounding. And in that moment, she knew. She wasn't just caught in Sinclair's world anymore. She was caught in something much, much bigger. And there was no way out.